Hello everyone, and very welcome to this presentation on global climate compensation. My name is Henrik Nordborg. I'm a professor of physics at the Eastern Switzerland University of Applied Sciences. And my main reason for giving this presentation is that I have listened to too many lectures about the climate crisis that do an excellent job on describing the problem we have and describing all the planetary boundaries we are transgressing, but they do a very poor job in offering realistic solutions. And I would like to change that by being a bit ambitious and offering a very concrete solution that would actually solve our problems on a global scale. And I would also argue that once we stop ignoring the obvious, once we accept the undeniable facts about our problem, the solution is equally obvious. This does not mean that it is simple or trivial in any way. We need to get a lot of people to pull in the same direction, but nonetheless, at least I hope to convince you that we know what to do. So in that sense, I promise you this will be a positive and optimistic lecture, even though the situation of our planet is not very good at the moment. I promise you, towards the end, I will show you how to fix the problem. So, what is the problem? Well, the problem we're having is that our planet is dying. And I tried to make this in kind of a Star Wars inspired slide with rolling text. The problem is that our planetary crisis would not be a good topic for a science fiction movie because we are not being attacked by aliens. We are not on a collision course with an asteroid. We're also not threatened by a collapsing sun. All the problems we are having is that we are deliberately destroying the biosphere of the only habitable planet in the known universe. And we are literally drowning in our own waste because at the end of the day, the greenhouse gases that cause global warming are waste products of our society. Anyway, so it will be difficult to turn that into a heroic Hollywood movie. But on the other hand, we see the problems. I often ask this question in my lectures, can we get serious now? Because the problems we are facing are obvious. These are immense floods in Brazil, May 2024, and floods can happen here in September 2024 in Czechia, and also another example of 100-year floods, as I typically call them. The problem is, of course, that these 100-year floods, the floods that are supposed to happen once per century, now seem to happen every 5 years or something. So why is this? Why do we have this situation? Well, one of the curves that I really like to show, I think this is a very important plot, is the carbon dioxide concentration of our atmosphere. So on the horizontal axis, we simply have time. On the vertical axis, we have a carbon concentration in the atmosphere, the measured carbon concentration in the atmosphere. The data that I'm using here are available under this link. So anyone with an internet connection and a decent plotting program can easily reproduce this plot. So what do we see? We see the oscillating blue curve here is the actual measured carbon concentration of the atmosphere. The oscillations are due to the breathing of the planet, which is a good thing. After all, this wouldn't happen on a dead planet. It means that the plants are growing in the spring and the summer, absorbing a lot of carbon dioxide, then the carbon dioxide concentration goes down. And then in the fall, winter, when we consume all the food that we have planted, and when the leaves rot, the leaves that have fallen off the trees rot in the forest, then we release a lot of carbon dioxide again. So these oscillations, by the way, they have an amplitude of so plus minus 4 ppm. Now, this is not the problem. The problem is the concentration here. We are now at 424. By the way, I update this plot regularly and always use the most recent data. So we are here at end of August 2024, the measured concentration 424.19 ppm. Now, before the Industrial Revolution, we were down somewhere at 280 parts per million. So that means that the concentration has increased by roughly 50%, which of course, to put it differently, means that every third carbon dioxide molecule, in the atmosphere is now man-made or produced by human civilization. I have allowed myself, I'm not sure all climate scientists would agree with this, to put in some limits here for the 1.5 degree target or boundary and the 2.0 degree boundary of warming. Now, I'm not too worried about the exact position here, because if you look carefully at this curve, it's not only increasing, it's actually bending upwards. To illustrate this point, I have put in a polynomial fit. This is a dashed black curve here. And this polynomial fit allows me to compute the derivative of the slope of this curve. Now you see in the 50s, in the end of the 50s, when they started measuring these values, the increase was 0.86, so less than 1 part per million per year. Currently, the concentration is increasing 3 times faster. So the only way to describe this, and this is what I tell my students, we are driving toward a wall and we are still accelerating. It doesn't really matter where this wall is. If you increase this by 10 ppm, it means that we will hit the wall a couple of years later, but it doesn't change anything. So the problem, of course, is not the exact position of these these boundaries here, or these lines, but the fact that the carbon concentration of the atmosphere is not only increasing, it's increasing faster than ever. Now, when I started to study physics, this was in the 80s, people were still talking about 350 ppm. There was a Stockholm conference on the climate, on the natural environment in 1972. It didn't really discuss the climate. The first conference that really looked into the problem of climate change was the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, 1992. This was signed at the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992. Then there was the Kyoto Protocol, there was a Paris Agreement, we have seen the climate strikes, Fridays for Future. There's of course been regular COP meetings, the last one was here, and none of these meetings have had any impact whatsoever on this trend. So this is of course a problem, and this is a problem of accepting some simple truths. The worrying thing, or what I find most worrying here, is that any suggestion that if we are accelerating toward a wall, perhaps at some point we should just remove the foot from the accelerator, is still considered politically highly radical. The suggestion that we should at some point perhaps apply the brake and to avoid hitting this wall is politically still completely out of the question. Okay, so my subtitle was, we need to stop ignoring the obvious. One obvious question to ask here is, where does this carbon dioxide come from? This is a clear rising trend, and it is the result of running a combustion engine indoors. I've started using this phrase in my lectures because it really shows how obvious it is. Our atmosphere is finite. Thus, whatever we are doing happens in a finite space. It's fairly large, but if you put enough carbon dioxide or enough pollution into the atmosphere, it will remain in the atmosphere, and it will end up eventually in our lungs or whatever. Now, the chemical reactions that are running our planet today are basically these. So first we have combustion of coal. So we take 1 ton of coal, and in order to burn that, we need 2.7 tons of oxygen, and this results in 3.7 tons of carbon dioxide. Now, this is important for many reasons. First, the only reason why carbon-based fuels, fossil fuels, are so useful in our society is, of course, because we take most of the fuel from the atmosphere without paying for it. And we dispose of all the waste into the atmosphere without paying for it. The same is true for gas. With gas, I mean natural gas here, so the methane, and then we have petrol, and then we have glucose. Glucose is, of course, what we humans do or animals do. So we have sugar, we eat lots of different things, it's turned into sugar. This glucose is being oxidized with oxygen. It's also a combustion process, and it also produces carbon dioxide. But anyway, you can't avoid this. And the point is, if you look at petrol, this means that if you fill up your tank, if you drive your car, you fill up the tank of your car, you are not only buying petrol or gas, as Americans, I guess, would call it, and you're also acquiring a license to destroy the atmosphere, because the petrol you buy would be completely useless if you didn't have the license to take oxygen out of the atmosphere and to dispose carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So it's a reasonable question to ask yourself, who gave the fossil fuel companies the right to sell this? This is a typical tragedy of a commons problem. The commons is the atmosphere, and everyone is just stealing stuff from the atmosphere without paying for it, and also disposing a lot of waste into the atmosphere without paying for it. Okay. The other important point here is that in order to produce a carbon dioxide molecule, CO2, you need, obviously, 1 atom of carbon. We can't produce carbon. Carbon atoms, the number of carbon atoms on our planet is a constant, plus minus. It's not changing too much. So the only thing we can actually decide is where to put this carbon. Now, if I want to need to combust something, like for a human being, we typically eat food. So if I grow wheat, for example, and then I make bread out of it, I eat the bread, and at some point in my body, this will be turned into glucose, and this will be oxidized, and I will produce carbon dioxide. A human being produces around 300 kilograms of carbon dioxide per year. Now, this is not a big problem, because when I grow the wheat again, the food that I eat will actually absorb, but the growing plants will absorb the same amount of carbon again, carbon dioxide. So this will be a closed cycle. So if you take the carbon from the natural carbon cycle, it is not possible to increase the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Thus, if you on the other hand dig carbon out of the ground, and I don't care whether this is methane, natural gas, oil, or coal, then this will eventually be turned into carbon dioxide. Eventually this stuff will oxidize, react with oxygen, and will be turned into carbon dioxide. So as long as we extract carbon from the ground, the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere will increase. The opposite is also true. if we stop extracting fossil fuels. If we leave stuff in the ground, the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere will stop increasing, for the simple reason that there's no carbon left. We don't have any carbon atoms to make carbon dioxide from. So there's really a one-to-one correspondence between climate change and our use of fossil fuels. Now, some people might object and say, well, that's not true. There is a contribution from land use. There is some other contribution that is true. Still, somewhere between 80 and 90% of a climate crisis, of a global warming we are seeing, is caused by fossil fuels. There's no doubt about that. And the reason is here. You need to make a carbon dioxide molecule, you need a carbon atom. And no one can argue with this statement. Okay, to prove his point, and again, based on completely publicly available data, I've made this plot on the horizontal axis. This is the increase of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Some of you might remember in the 50s is what 0.86 was below 1 part per million per year, and then today is around 2.6 part per million per year. So this is the annual increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. On the vertical axis, we have the annual carbon emissions produced by mankind as taken from this website. This is the Global Carbon Budget 2023. And I think we can all agree there's a strong correlation here. Actually, up until a couple of years ago, I used to take a straight line, or draw a straight line through this. This is now a polynomial fit, because you see something quite worrying up here. Even though the annual carbon emissions have not been rising very much in the last couple of years, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is still increasing faster and faster. Now, there could be two reasons for this, or perhaps even more. One reason is that people are cheating with their carbon accounting. This is, of course, based on reported emissions by governments, etc. And of course, if these reported emissions are not correct, then this could explain the effect. The other explanation, and that is of course very worrying, is that our planet is slowly losing its capacity to absorb carbon, because the carbon dioxide that is being emitted into the atmosphere, it doesn't all end up in the atmosphere. Some of it is absorbed by roughly half is absorbed by the seas, by water, well, seas and lakes, but I guess the main part is the seas, and the other part, and some of it is of course also absorbed by plants and etc. And the trend we are seeing here is that perhaps our planet is losing its ability to absorb carbon. Okay, based on this, it is important to use the right language. I will try to use that. Climate change is a bad word because it's of course more or less invented by the oil industry, because they wanted something really neutral. So climate change, well, climate is climate, and change, it doesn't tell you anything about who is responsible for the change. It doesn't also tell you if it's bad or good. And if you listen to media today, you see this deliberate abuse of language in many places. For example, you will see a headline that Palestinians are dying in Gaza, and of course they're not dying, they're being killed. So it's important to, when you look at, when you use language, you use the right terminology. I would, the correct way to talk about it would of course be to talk about anthropogenic climate change with disastrous repercussions. That would describe the situation. That is kind of inconvenient. It's a far too long phrase. So I allow myself to describe that as climate destruction, because that is exactly what it is. We are deliberately, the climate is not changing. We are not in a heroic fight against the changing climate here. We are deliberately destroying the climate by pumping out tons of greenhouse gases, or gigatons of greenhouse gases, into the atmosphere every year. And of course, carbon dioxide is the main component. Methane is also a very important component, but the trend is the same. It's also increasing faster and faster, the methane concentration. Okay, what are the results? Well, we all know this. Again, a plot which I have made from publicly available data. Here are global measurements, the surface temperature anomaly. So it's basically you measure the temperature in various places of the world, and you compute an average. There's no modeling involved. These are just measured data, just like the carbon data I showed before. And if you look at it, it's interesting. I've put the 0 for the first 30 years, so by definition the anomaly is 30 years. The plus signs represent monthly deviations from the average in degrees centigrade. The blue curve corresponds to the yearly averages. The red curve is an 11-year average, and I think the trend is clear. Up to the 1970s or so, you could probably argue that, well, we haven't seen any global warming yet. From 1980 or so, the signal is really clear. I've also allowed myself to put in a line here, so this is the last 30 years, and I simply extrapolate it until I hit 2 degrees. And if you go on like this will be before the middle of this century. We see that the rise of temperature is roughly more than 0.2 degrees, 0.23 degrees per decade, sort of. The July 2024 was 1.47 degrees too hot. The last 12 months were 1.57 degrees too hot. Now, you will see slightly different numbers in different sources, but again, that's not the point. The point is not the exact location of these plus signs. The problem is the slope here. And when I show this plot to young people, I really feel bad about it. I mean, I'm old enough to probably die before we will see the worst effects of, or even worse effects of climate change. But my students or my children, people who are born after the year 2000, who can reasonably expect to live for another 5 or 6 decades. If you're born in the year 2000, you can more or less, you can expect to be around in the year 2080. So just imagine you take this plot here and you extrapolate this trend until the year 2080. I mean, it's completely off the charts here. And that doesn't really look good for the young generation. And by the way, this is also an important point which I would like to stress. Many of these climate scenarios you see, they only plot temperature development until the year 2100, and then they stop. Just remember, there are lots of people alive on this planet today who will be alive in the year 2100. I mean, children, today many people survive until they're 90 or so. To live until you're 80 is not unusual. So anyone born after the year 2020 can reasonably suggest or expect to be alive in the year 2100. So this is not the far future we're talking about here. Anyway, this is a small summary. I guess climate scientists will probably hate me for it, but I plot it anyway because it's just summarizing what I said before. Here we have carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere from 280 or so in before Industrial Revolution until the values we have today, around 420. Here we have a temperature anomaly, and yes, there are lots of fluctuations. We have El Niños and La Niñas and all kinds of weather patterns, and not all of it is completely understood, but that again does not matter if you pull the trend is clear. And if anything, global warming is accelerating, and this has also been shown in a lot of papers. Now, this is also an important point. Big oil always knew. There's no doubt about it. This paper, many of you might have probably seen this. This is a memo to the Exxon management about CO2 greenhouse effect from the year 1982. So the oil company Exxon did its internal research. They had their researchers looking into this problem, and this hand-drawn plot here is the conclusion, represents the conclusion of the research. The upper curve here is expected carbon dioxide concentrations. And remember, this was published or circulated in the year 1982. So the research was done obviously before that, so probably in the end of it, at the end of the 70s or something. And they predicted in 1980 or so that by 2020 we would reach 420 ppm. The blue curve is the actual measured carbon dioxide concentration. So well done, Exxon. They really predicted this. By the way, the comparison between the actual measured values and their predictions is from this paper, Supran, Ramsdorff, and Obreskes. And yeah, they just make the point that the oil companies obviously knew. And they didn't only know, they were able to predict fairly precisely what was going to happen. Actually, this is interesting. So the lower curve here is the temperature, the prediction from Exxon from the early 80s, and the actual temperature. So Exxon actually believed that they were destroying the planet faster than they actually did. Apparently our planet turned out to be a bit more resilient than Exxon predicted, but I mean that doesn't that doesn't help. It actually makes it worse. And of course we all know the story. They didn't make these predictions public. On the contrary, they started investing money in lobbying, in fake research, etc., to convince people that the climate change or climate destruction wasn't a problem. And of course, Upton Sinclair understood the process very well. It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it. I mean, it says it all. It's all about money. So where are we today? This is a global energy demand in exajoules from 1965 until 2023. You see we have the lowest. Here we have oil, coal, gas, nuclear, hydropower, and renewables. So this sliver up here is wind energy and solar energy, solar energy in all forms. So the good news is obviously the renewable energy sources are increasing very fast. There's no doubt about it. It's growing way faster than the others. The bad news is, of course, it started out with a very small sliver, so it's still roughly, I think from the last year, don't quote me on it, I think it was roughly 8% or something. What is really worrying is, of course, that total energy demand is increasing faster than the renewables, which means that demand for oil, gas, and coal is also increasing. And that's, of course, a big problem. That means that we are still not replacing fossil fuels with renewables, the renewables cannot keep up with increasing energy demand. And that is, of course, a very important point. And I'm going to come back to that again in a while. There's absolutely no guarantee that if you install renewable energy, this will lead to a decrease in the use of fossil fuels. This would only be the case if the total demand is capped, if there's an upper limit. But we are far from that point yet. Many countries could use at least according to research done by the oil companies, most countries in the world live in energy poverty still. The problem, and you hear this a lot from oil companies, is that they need to produce more energy. We don't have enough energy to satisfy the energy needs of humanity. Thus, if we build more renewables, yes, we will use more energy in total, and it will not reduce the amount of fossil fuel that we are using. Okay, so many years ago I made this plot as a kind of crowd pleaser. It typically makes the audience laugh. It is sort of funny. So what I've done here is I've simply plotted carbon dioxide emissions, unit gigatons per year. I started, I think, 1975. These are the black curve here with the dots, and then global GDP, so gross domestic product, for the same time interval. This is a solid red line with the plus signs. And you see there's a close correlation between them. It's not 1-to-1, but it's fairly close. You see, for example, that the only times where we have had a drop in carbon dioxide emissions has been associated, it has always been associated with a drop in economic performance. This is the financial crisis, 2008, 2009. This is, of course, the COVID pandemic. In both cases, you see a drop in GDP accompanied by a drop in carbon emissions. So there seems to be a very close correlation here. Now, our politicians, in their infinite wisdom, have decided, and this is not a joke, that we need to continue economic growth to lift people out of poverty, etc., which I totally agree with. We need to lift people out of poverty, but that the economy should basically continue to grow as before. This is just a continuation of the previous growth. It's roughly 3% per year, so that the economy will be significantly larger in the year 2040 than it is today, roughly more than 40% larger. And the same politicians then go to the Paris Agreement and sign a deal that carbon emissions have to go like this. Why do they do this? Well, it's interesting. At the first COP meeting, or at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in 1992, and just remember, 1992, in those days, this was the days of a unipolar world order. The United States were the only great nation, the only superpower, the only remaining superpower in the world. China was nowhere in 1992. Their emissions in the Kyoto Protocol, people basically agreed that the emissions from China could be ignored. The Soviet Union had recently collapsed. America was a superpower. And so if the only person who had anything to say about the matter, who actually had the power to influence the development of the world or to do something about climate change, was President George H.W. Bush. And he goes to Rio de Janeiro, to the Earth Summit, with a simple message: the American lifestyle is non-negotiable. If you ask me, this would have been the good time to close down the entire COP meeting, because it's obvious if Americans are not even remotely interested in solving the problem, why should we even try? Or perhaps we need a different approach. Anyway, my point is that there are no technologies that will allow this to happen. I mean, I worked for a big engineering energy company for 8 years. I work with energy technology today, and this is simply not going to happen. It cannot happen because if you look at the inertia of the energy sector, a commercial airplane is typically built to last for 25 years. Most cars that are being used on our streets have a life expectancy of 20 years. Heating systems, power plants last much longer, meaning that most of the emissions that we have here are built into the system. If we don't do something very drastic, the emissions will not go down. Now, I don't want to make you too worried about this. Well, you should be worried, but my point is only this. I mean, this is ridiculous. This is the official energy policy, continued economic growth and saving the environment. This is a famous decoupling that most people are talking about. And it's obvious that that will not happen. And now you can ask yourself, do the politicians who talk about it, are they stupid or are they lying? I leave that to you, but they are not based in reality. Okay, now, and just to make it absolutely clear, I found this nice movie, which I think is the best explanation I've ever seen about why exponential growth cannot work. So bear with me. It's taken from a film, There Is No Tomorrow. You can find the film on YouTube. I put the link there. But I just allow myself to extract a section about exponential growth, which I think is just brilliant.
These bacteria live in a bottle. Their population doubles every minute. At 11 a.m., there is one bacterium. At 12 noon, the bottle is full. It is half full at 11:59, leaving only enough space for one more doubling. The bacteria see the danger. They search for new bottles and find 3. They assume that their problem is solved. By 12 noon, the first bottle is full. By 12:01, the second bottle is full. By 12:02, all the bottles are full. This is the problem that we face due to the doubling caused by exponential growth.
So this just makes the point, the famous statement by Kenneth Boulding, anyone who believes in indefinite growth in anything physical on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist. And I mean, face it, economic growth will stop very soon. Some people argue that the economy is actually not growing anymore anyway, but it's clear it will not continue like that. In other words, when we talk about how to solve our problems, we need to think about ways to do that without economic growth. Okay, from this, I hope, I promised, I wanted to convince you, try to convince you that the solution to our problems is obvious. The first part, at least we can probably agree on that, keep it in the ground. The only way to prevent climate disaster is to keep as much as possible of the remaining fossil fuels in the ground. This cannot be done by installing renewable energies, because they do not necessarily reduce the demand for fossil fuel, since the total energy demand is unlimited, or very large. It's not yet saturated, at least. The other thing, I'm not going to talk much about it, carbon capture is, of course, a technology invented by the fossil fuel industry to give them sort of a license to continue to work. I allow, sometimes satire works better than scientific argument. There's an excellent Honest Government ad about carbon capture and storage. It's really funny, but I think it's fairly clear. So far carbon capture has not worked as promised. There are no realistic scenarios for how to scale up carbon capture to the level that it would actually solve the problem. And for different reasons, I also don't believe in it. Now, I allow myself to quote Darren Woods here. He's the CEO of Exxon. I typically don't agree too much with the CEO of Exxon, but I think he's right on this point. It's taken from a long interview that he gave with Fortune magazine, and he claims that the climate crisis is a demand problem, not a supply problem. What he means by that is, of course, as long as we have a society that is completely dependent on fossil fuels, oil, gas, whatever, you can't simply switch off the production, because that would lead to mayhem. And we know that. I mean, if you take every time energy prices increase, there's a lot of political protest, and I mean, naturally so, because people are dependent on fuel. If you cannot heat your house, you're going to feel miserable. If you cannot afford to drive to work, you're not, well, you will also be a bit miserable. So we know that we cannot simply switch off the extraction of fossil fuel. And of course the oil companies know this very well. This is why they can basically blackmail our governments all the time. If we were to turn off oil production tomorrow, the vast majority of humanity would simply die. There's no way we could manage without fossil fuels today to produce enough food, to distribute enough food, etc., to heat our houses. Now, the another thing which is important is that renewable energies are not too expensive. Fossil fuels are too cheap. This is very important to understand, because there's no way science and technology will make fossil fuels more expensive. Typically, scientists, engineers always work on ways to make things cheaper, and there are lots of people working in the fossil fuel in the sector who actually work on that all the time. So if we accept this premise that fossil fuels are too cheap, it's clear that it's a political problem we have to solve. It will not be solved by technology. Politicians, or we as a society, have to make fossil fuels artificially more expensive to be able to solve the problem. Now, the good news, and this is what I hope I will be able to convince you, is that we don't need a world government for this. And I think it's quite remarkable. Market economy, we don't even have to discuss market economy. Market economies have been around as long as there have been people, basically. And it's, as Adam Smith correctly pointed out, it is a necessity for specialization. As soon as the first humans started making tools, they probably realized very quickly that some people were better at making tools than others. But of course, the guy who was good at making tools should be able to work on making tools. And then, of course, he needed a market so he could buy the food. And I personally want the world to work like this. If someone is an excellent musician, or an excellent actor, or a poet, or whatever, I would like these people to focus on their craft, to be able to focus on their craft. But of course, then they need to be able to buy their food. So any kind of specialization in a society requires market economy. And this is why market economies have been around for so long. Now, capitalism is something completely different, and people are very confused about that. Capitalism has nothing to do with a free market. You can have a free market without capitalism, but capitalism has been fairly successful, and the reason why the capitalism has been so successful is because it is basically an algorithm. The idea with capitalism is that you say, okay, people start making money, and we make sure that the people who are the best at making money, who are really good at multiplying money, making even more money, they get most of the money. And this is a so-called positive feedback loop, and it leads to exponential growth. And my point is that these are basically algorithms. There's very little government involvement in the market economy. People simply trade. Capitalism also can run without government, and I would argue that the market economy can also be modified to solve the climate crisis, or make a big step in the right direction. Now, and the way you do this is through feedback loops. Now, just to give you a simple example here so that we know what we're talking about. Feedback loops are used everywhere both in technology and nature. Typical example, you have a house, you want to heat this house, you want to have a comfortable temperature inside. There's no way you can predict how much heat you will need for this. Why? Because the amount of heat you need to keep the temperature inside the house comfortable depends on obviously the weather outside, not only the temperature, also if it's windy or not, if the sun is shining, if it's raining. It also depends on the number of people in the house, because every person generates about 100 watts of heat. It depends on whether the windows are open or closed. It depends on whether how often you open the door, etc. So it's one of these problems. It's not that we are too stupid to calculate this today. It is a simple manifestation of the fact that we cannot predict the future, i.e. we cannot in advance predict how much heat we will need to heat this house. Now, the problem can be solved anyway. We put in a thermostat. And a thermostat is a negative feedback loop. We simply measure the temperature inside. Then we say, and this is then connected to the heater, and we say, if the temperature is too hot inside, we do not heat, and if it's too cold, we heat. Problem solved. Simple, and this is called a negative feedback loop. It's intended to stabilize the system. And these are everywhere, autopilots of airplanes. These nice drones that everyone seems to be flying around with today, with the quadrocopters. It would be impossible to fly such a quadrocopter without a small unit that constantly measures the acceleration and the position of these drones and adjust the speed of the rotors to keep the thing stable. I mean, they look terribly very stable, but that is just because the speed of the rotors is being controlled constantly, or monitored and modified constantly. Now, so this is how you solve difficult problems. And my point is that you should use, this is the only thing we can do with carbon emissions, because, and I'm getting a bit fed up with people who write papers, make models where they estimate that yes, the energy transition is possible, no, the energy transition is not possible. The fact of the matter is that we don't know, and the reason why we don't know is we don't know how technology is going to evolve. We can make estimates, but yes, they're typically wrong. Yes, we can predict the technology that we will have for the next 10 years, but for more than that, we simply don't know. But even more, we do not know, we cannot predict how people's behavior will change, because there's a huge behavioral component to our energy consumption, especially in rich countries where we fly on vacation, etc. And if suddenly energy becomes scarce, if energy becomes more expensive, we don't know how the society will respond to that. Now, so let's find out, and that's the idea with global climate compensation. The idea is extremely simple. As I told you, we know exactly where the carbon comes from. It comes from the companies that extract fossil fuel from the ground, extract carbon from the crust of the earth. It's a very small number of companies doing this, a couple of hundred. People often talk about the 70 carbon majors, and it is true. With 70 companies, you have the vast majority of all carbon that's been produced. But even if you include all, we are talking about perhaps 200 to 300 companies, not more than that. So, and they know exactly how much carbon they produce. If Shell produces a barrel of oil, we know exactly how much carbon is in this barrel of oil. I mean, there's no doubt about it. They know it because that's basically what they're selling. So there's no problem for them to pay a fee proportional to the production. It's not proportional to emissions. They don't have to measure their emissions. They basically say, I sell 1 ton of coal or 1 barrel of oil, and based on the carbon content of this barrel of oil or the ton of coal, I pay a fee to Global Fund. Easy to implement, could be done tomorrow, basically, especially with the publicly owned companies, because if you are, they always submit their Shell, Exxon, they have their quarterly reports, and if you read their quarterly report, they will tell you exactly how much fossil fuel they have produced. So you could basically read their quarterly reports and send them an invoice. No problem to implement, and a small number of corporations. Now we take this money and we give it back to the world's nations on a per capita basis. And I will show you, it's astonishing. I will give you a small example, and I will show you how that would basically go a long way towards solving global poverty, because poorer countries would receive a lot of money this way. Now, this is an algorithm. These are the rules of the game. They're easy to implement. We don't need any political debate about them. It's a clear scheme. The only thing we have to agree on is the amount of carbon emissions, or the price on carbon emission. How much does 1 ton of carbon dioxide cost? Now, the problem with this approach is it would probably work. Why? As I said, the fossil fuel companies, there's a small number of them, and they're not being punished with this scheme. I've actually talked, I have friends working in the fossil fuel industry. I've talked to them, and most of them say, well, what's the problem? If the rules are the same for all companies, why should we be worried? Because they only act as tax collectors. The thing is, of course, with this scheme, we only say to, well, Shell, or take BP, for example, that you pay per barrel of oil you produce, you pay a fee to Global Fund. They would, of course, pass on these costs to their customers, meaning that they would not suffer too much, the customer who would have to pay more. So what that means that we have introduced a global carbon tax without any loopholes, and we have done this by only taxing 200 to 300 companies worldwide. Now, the cost will be passed on to customers. This is very important because it means that we are now taxing the entire fossil fuel-based value chain. We are not punishing the oil companies. We are really addressing the demand, the companies that actually burn the fuel. And this is very important. Just give you one example. There's a big discussion about carbon emissions in China. Yes, China has large carbon emissions, but they also have a large population, and two, they actually produce a lot of stuff that we consume in the West. So if you talk about quotas, there's a lot of discussion. Well, do they have to reduce as much as we do in the West, etc.? With this scheme, you could just skip all these discussions. The Chinese manufacturer would have to pay more for fossil fuel. Everyone would have to pay more for fossil fuel and energy, but he would just pass it on. I mean, he's manufacturing a product, he will pass on the higher cost to the consumers, and the consumer in the West, the person who actually consumes the product, will actually have to pay. Or another way to put this will mean that, however, the increase of costs would be higher if your product needs a lot of fossil fuel. Another way of describing this is to say profits resulting from fossil fuels are socialized. If you have a company that really needs a lot of fossil fuel to make a profit, you would suffer, and most of the profits you made with this company would be returned to the fund. Obviously, by making fossil fuels more expensive, renewable energy would get a competitive advantage, and this would create an enormous boost in our in building renewable energies. And the thing that the consumer pays is, of course, also important, because anyone who consumes fossil fuel in this scheme would pay unless you can pass on the costs to the next one. If you actually consume a product, if you burn gas, well, then you are out of luck. If you buy a product that can be recycled, then of course you can get this cost back. So this would also be an enormous boost for the circular economy. What I like about the scheme is we achieve this without any regulation, any administration or red tape. Why? Because, as I said to you, only these 200-300 companies, the small number of fossil fuel companies, would have to do anything. And for them it would be trivial because they know how much fossil fuel they produce. They only pay a fee. They would just have to get used to paying this fee. They will raise up prices. Everyone else in the society, we wouldn't see any regulations. We would only simply see rising costs. And I think this is also an important point, many businesses today argue that they are carbon neutral or net zero or whatever. Now, the proof is in the pudding. If your business is carbon neutral, then your cost of production wouldn't increase with this scheme. And if your cost of production increase with this scheme, then you're lying. Then your production is not carbon neutral. You can't have it both ways. So in a way, this would be a very nice scheme in showing who's actually lying and who's telling the truth. Any company that has a problem with this plan has been lying about their willingness to predict or to protect the climate. There's no loopholes. This is excellent because since the tax is actually, fossil fuels are taxed at the source, it means there's no way to avoid, you cannot avoid paying this tax. The billionaire in the Cayman Islands with his private jet would have to pay this tax because there's no way on the planet where you can buy fossil fuels without paying this tax. This would also be good to prevent outsourcing because in contrast to national carbon taxing schemes, the price would increase in all countries. The countries with the highest energy efficiency would benefit, but if you increase the price everywhere, there's no reason why it suddenly should make sense to outsource your production to a low-cost country. And I will also show you this, more than 80% of the world's population would profit. So if the world were a democracy, this would have been introduced a long time ago. So I argue that this simple plan covers the following points. I'm already alluded to the tragedy of the commons. The problem we have is the atmosphere is, in that sense, the commons. Everyone has been abusing the atmosphere. But when it comes to fossil fuels, this problem can be solved trivially. The prisoner's dilemma, why is this important? Well, we have this problem that it's difficult currently for one country to have an aggressive decarbonization strategy without losing competitiveness. Now, this plan solves that problem because we increase the price of carbon fossil fuels in all countries. Climate justice, well, as I will show you, because of a redistribution, we are paying back the money from the fund on a per capita basis. This is automatically taken care of. And democracy, I told you that 80% of the world's population will benefit from this, i.e. problem solved. Thus, global carbon compensation actually checks off all these four criteria or requirements on a useful solution. Now, simple example, I don't know if this, I introduced this because I got questions the last time I gave this lecture. So perhaps this can explain a bit what will happen. So consider, let's assume we have an energy intensive company here. So this is a company that produces something and the energy is 50% of a cost. Then there's some material cost and labor costs and other costs. And this is the total production cost. If we now introduce global carbon compensation, what will happen? The energy costs will increase. The material costs will also increase indirectly because typically whatever materials we use a lot of fossil fuels to extract them. The labor costs will not increase very much at all, and the other costs, let's assume they're constant. That means that if you have a business model that depends a lot of energy on energy, then yes, your costs would increase. Now, if you have a low energy intensity, or a labor intensive product, so you have a product, the energy part is smaller, the materials part is smaller, you have much larger labor costs and then other costs. The introduction of global compensation would of course increase the cost of a product less. So this is why I believe that unions everywhere should be in favor of this, because we know that automation, if you look at the world today, lots of jobs have been lost to automation. Now, this is of course, and the reason for that is of course that energy costs have been lower than labor costs. Now, with global carbon compensation is going to change that. Companies that use a lot of labor will not suffer much, and they will have no incentive to replace the labor force or their workforce with a machine. Companies that have use a lot of machines which are very energy intensive will actually have a problem in competing. Okay, quick calculations. Let's assume we fix the price at $100 per ton of carbon dioxide. Currently, the carbon emissions from fossil fuels is around 36 gigatons, give or take. So that would give us $3,600 billion or $3.6 trillion annually. The fossil fuel companies would pay in $3.6 trillion to this fund annually. My rough estimate is that just because of the carbon price, this will increase the price of a barrel of oil by roughly $42. That's significant. And by the way, I'm not saying that $100 is the right number. I think it's a nice number, but you could of course start with a smaller number if you wanted to. This is just to make it easy to see the effects of the plan. $42 or roughly 30 cents per liter of oil. Now this is important. These $3.6 trillion divided by the population of the Earth would be enough to give every human being on this planet a global yearly income of $450 or $38 per month. Now you see the trick. A poorer country like perhaps Bangladesh, especially a populous country with a lower per capita income, would benefit because they have a fairly low carbon footprint. Yes, they would also have to pay this tax, but of course they don't consume that much, i.e. their cost of living would not increase very much. On the other hand, they will get a lot of money back from the fund. So, and if you do the math, you will, and I will show you an example later, 80% of the world population would actually benefit from this plan. So I think it would go a long way towards abolishing global poverty. For comparison, global GDP is around $100 trillion, so we are talking about a couple of percent of global GDP. Global defense spending is 2.4 trillion, so 2/3 of what we would pay for this carbon compensation, we already pay for the military. So if we could get the world to collaborate and stop fighting, we could reduce defense spending, and then we could easily afford this. The global fossil fuel subsidies, and I think this is for 2022, from according to the IMF, the direct subsidies for the fossil fuel sector is roughly $1.3 trillion. And if you include indirect subsidies, you get $7 trillion. So again, these numbers are fairly comparable. And lost tax revenue due to tax havens, there is a number for that too, about 500 billion. So if it's that simple, why hasn't this been done before? And this brings us to a plot which I find it's scandalous that this plot is not shown everywhere, or these plots. So look at the world today. I went to the World Bank, data.worldbank.org. Here you can download lots of interesting data. So I took the population from all countries in the world. I think it's 2022. The numbers are from 2022. And I divided the world into 3 blocks. So the global north, this is United States, the European Union, with Canada, Australia, Japan, etc. Then the BRICS countries, so these are of course Brazil, Russia, China, India, South Africa, and then we have the rest. Less than 14% of the world's population live in the global north. Now, let's look at GDP, global GDP, the size of the economy, gross domestic product. And you get a slightly different plot. 56% of the world's GDP is still generated or consumed in the global north. So what this means is, of course, that the people in the global north, and there are lots of studies showing this, we have a far too large carbon footprint, use far too many resources, and these resources are, of course, extracted from the rest of the world. In a way, think about ancient Rome. We are like the empire, and we are or the British Empire. We live well, but we need imports from the entire world to keep our standard of living. Now you can ask yourself, okay, why on earth does the rest of the world agree with that they are basically being plundered to give us the resources we need? And then you look at military spending, and then everything is clear. So the global north is responsible for almost 66% of global military spending. So case closed. We basically extract the way the world works today is that the global north extracts resources from the rest of the world basically at gunpoint. And I think what we are seeing today with BRICS getting stronger is that the rest of the world is not going to take this anymore. And my personal conviction is that if we want to have a peaceful planet, and we need a peaceful planet to solve any problems, including the climate crisis or the biodiversity climate crisis, then we have to solve this problem first. We need to find a way where we can share resources on the planet equitably, because otherwise we are heading for major wars. No, but this is of course important, because if I now look at the contributions to the global fund from global carbon compensation, you get the following picture. Well, I already said this. So I tried to estimate the net contributions to the fund. And the thing is, of course, that every country would have to pay a fossil fuel tax. Everything we consume will become more expensive, because we now pay a cost for the fossil fuel that has been used to produce this product. On the other hand, every country in the world, including the rich countries, will of course receive a payout from the fund. The total number, as I told you, $3,600 billion going to the fund every year, 450 per capita. But then I made the following small estimate. So I said, okay, the global north would of course be a net contributor to this fund. So estimate 1.5 trillion of the money going, they would pay in a lot to this fund, they would get some back, but the difference would be 1.5 trillion. So the net contributor to the fund would be the global north. The BRICS countries and the rest of the world would be net beneficiaries. They would actually receive more money from the fund than they actually pay in. And this is, of course, well, there's nothing you can do about it. If you have a polluters pay principle, it means that polluters will have to pay. The global north has caused the problem, and fixing it will cost a lot of money. And this, to me, this was always the absurd thing about the COP negotiations, the United Nations Conference on the Climate. It is obvious we have a world where, especially if you include historic emissions, there's no doubt that Germany, Great Britain, and especially the United States are responsible for the bulk part of global warming that has happened. Yes, China is now catching up, but if you take historic emissions, there's no doubt about it who have caused the problem. These countries have also managed to get very rich from fossil fuels. And now they refuse to pay. I mean, how can you solve any problem if the countries that have the money and have caused the problem and have gotten rich by causing the problem simply refuse to pay? So, I mean, if we want to solve the problem, and this is the obvious fact, then of course the global north will have to pay for it. And this global carbon compensation would be an elegant way of making sure that that happens. So why should the global north agree? Well, because not fixing the problem will be even more expensive. This plot is from a paper by the Potsdam Institute of Climate Impact Research, showing which parts of the world will be most heavily impacted by global warming. And you see, of course, again, the global north, at least Canada, Scandinavia, and especially Russia will not have a problem. So you could perhaps say that, well, the global north could say, okay, we will not feel the impact of climate change that much, so why should we bother? But if that was the plan, the people were not very smart, because United States will actually be seriously impacted by climate change. Australia will be seriously impacted by climate change. And if that was our plan, then we probably should have teamed up with Russia, because Russia will be one of the part that will not suffer from that much from climate change. Anyway, the point I want to make is their estimate is that we are talking about $38 trillion of damage each year. So that is, and I was talking about, when I talk about global climate compensation, I'm talking about $3.6 trillion, so 10% of that per year. So I think it is in all our interest. The smartest thing we can do is first to end conflicts, then come up with a scheme that actually encourages countries to work together, and implement climate justice and a global carbon tax. And that's would be the most efficient way to solve this problem. Further information, just to confirm my point, there was a very recent paper now from the Stockholm Resilience Center about, and just emphasizing that if you want to solve, if you want to survive, if you want to stay within planetary boundaries, we need a just world. You can't have a small number of countries just consuming far too much. And of course also the fact that we owe the global south a lot of money because of CO2 emissions. So it's not just me. There are lots of papers arguing that if we are going to fix the problem, the global north will have to pay. Okay, so with this, I think global carbon compensation is a rational solution to the problem because, and I think this is a very important point, at the moment we are conducting an uncontrolled, irreversible, high-risk experiment with the only habitable planet in the known universe. All the experts say that this will not end well. Why should we be worried about conducting a controlled, reversible, risk-free experiment with the economic system? Now think about it. Introducing global climate compensation, just arguing that a couple of hundred companies will have to pay a fee proportionate to the amount of stuff they produce, fossil fuel they produce, to global fund. Implementation is absolutely trivial, and it wouldn't break the world. So if you don't want to start with $100, let's start with $25. that would increase the cost of a barrel of oil by $10, which is well within the range of fluctuations you have anyway. So no one can argue that this would destroy the world in any sense. It would just make the world a bit more equitable and make renewables a bit more competitive. The point is, we argue at length. There's a lot of research on social cost of carbon. I'm bless them, the guys who work on it, but I don't see the point of that number. Because there's no way we know. The only thing we know is that currently the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere is not only increasing, but increasing faster and faster. That means to me that the price of fossil fuels is too low. I don't know how high it has to be, but neither does anyone else. So let's put in a thermostat, let's put in a price and start turning up this price knob, and we will see what happens. But that is the problem. We know that we need to stop using fossil fuels. There's no doubt about it. The only thing we don't know is how fast can this happen without causing general mayhem. Implementing global climate compensation, this is a very scientific approach to the problem because it would provide the answer. If we make fossil fuels more expensive, then, and if decoupling is possible, then this global tax or this global fee would simply accelerate the transition to a decarbonized energy system. If it's possible, decoupling will happen, and I can live with that. I don't mind. Personally, I believe it will not happen fast enough. In other words, when we increase the price of fossil fuels, degrowth will happen automatically because prices will increase. And then it is, of course, extremely important to have redistribution. And I'm not talking about redistribution inside nations. I'm talking about we have to make sure that people, especially in poorer countries, can still survive. Another nice thing about global carbon compensation is that it would actually be a system where all countries again would collaborate. And it would reduce global tensions because suddenly, today people are fighting over access to fossil fuels because it's extremely profitable to have fossil fuels. Fossil fuels would be less valuable if we implement this system because all the profits you generate from fossil fuels would be shared equitably with the rest of the population. And I think this is an extremely important point. If the world were a democracy, if every human being had one vote, this system would have been implemented immediately. So it's kind of paradoxical because it's always the Western democracies who believe we are the people who represent democracy and human rights and whatnot. Actually, we are the ones blocking a sensible solution to the climate crisis. So, and the problem we have is, of course, Kurt Vonnegut. I found this quote from Kurt Vonnegut recently. We could have saved the Earth, but we were too damn cheap. At the end of the day, the question is, we have a big problem. Solving this problem will cost a lot of money. We don't want that. Or some people don't want that. I would argue that most people actually do want that. There's a small number of very rich people who don't want it. The rest of us probably want to save the Earth. And I wrote a blog post recently about that, about the kind of hypocrisy of the global north. Anyway, to wrap up, I love this cartoon, which I found many years ago. It's from Justin Bilicki, published by the Union of Concerned Scientists. Research concludes we are destroying Earth. And then you have government saying, could you kindly rephrase that in equivocal, inaccurate, vague, self-serving, and roundabout terms that we all can understand? This is the problem. the message is clear. We know what we have to do. We simply don't want to do it. And I tried to make a diagram to illustrate this point. The purpose of science is to understand what is physically possible. Or to put it differently, what science can do is to identify the parameter space of physically viable solutions. This will not be perfect, but at least I can work on this. And on the other hand, we have a so-called Overton window. We have a parameter space of acceptable government policy. So this is kind of the things where politicians believe that they can get a political majority for doing. And so far, the whole curse of the climate debate has been that the intersection of these two is an empty set. There is no overlap. Now, for many, many years, governments have tried, and I think they've been fairly serious about it, they were not always lying. They've been trying to move this, to invest a bit in research, to move this parameter set of physically viable solutions to the right, so that to find some common ground with politics. After 30 years or so, we realize that this guy does not budge. And there are simple thermodynamic reasons for that. And as Richard Feynman so brilliantly put it once, for a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled. We have tried to move this. We have invested in lots of different technologies. This stupid set of physically viable solution doesn't budge. Now, what I'm arguing is that perhaps we should do the following. The work of us has to be to move the Overton window. We have to shift the set of acceptable government policies to a position where we have some subset that is physically viable and also politically acceptable. And I would argue that if we do that, then we will realize that global climate compensation will fit into this intersection. Okay, and with that, I think I'm basically done. I found this quote, I think I got it from Chris Hedges. It's a quote from St. Augustine. Hope has two beautiful daughters. The names are anger and courage. Anger at the way things are, and courage to see that they do not remain the way they are. And once we cut through the lies, the greenwashing and the propaganda, I argue that what remains is a simple choice to do the right thing. And the right thing is obvious. We need to stop using fossil fuels as quickly as possible. And I was really thrilled some weeks ago when I found an old speech given by Rudolf Clausius, Professor Rudolf Clausius. This was, some of you might know the name from Clausius Clapeyron. He was one of the inventors of thermodynamics, especially the second law of thermodynamics. He gives a speech in the year 1885, and he calls for a global moratorium on the use of coal. In other words, to him, as an intelligent person who understood thermodynamics, it was obvious that we cannot build a society on fossil fuels. And he wrote that 150 years ago. And this is the simple truth. I will come back to this point in a future lecture on thermodynamics, why it was so obvious to Clausius that we cannot use fossil fuels. And because it's a question of thermodynamics, but it also gives me kind of reassurance that this is on the right track, because, as I said, the fact that we need to stop using fossil fuels is undisputable. No one can argue that it's a good thing to extract fossil fuels from the ground. I mean, if you do that, you're simply stupid. Sorry. The problem we have is that we have built a society that is extremely dependent on fossil fuels. We cannot simply switch off the production of fossil fuels. That would lead to famine, wars, and general mayhem. Thus, the question is, how can we get out of fossil fuels as quickly as possible? I don't know the answer. Nobody else knows the answer. The only thing I know is that if we introduce a price, a global price on fossil fuels, a global tax fee, whatever you want to call it, and we make sure that the money we collect via this tax is distributed equitably, then that will be a big step in the right direction. And in addition, it will give us a lot of information about how fast we can get out. It's in a way, the only rational and scientific approach to this, to solving this problem. So thank you a lot for your attention. It took me a bit longer than I hoped, but anyway, I hope you enjoyed the lecture. I'm looking forward to your feedback and comments, and I will continue to post lectures about not only about this topic, but also about thermodynamics and why Rudolf Clausius was right 150 years ago.